You're listening to a conversation that is part of the Centre for Future Nature's series on commoning and enclosure. My name is Anushka, and these conversations invite people to explore the possibilities and practices of commons and commoning around the world. Together, we think about plural futures and plural ecologies and the action and struggle involved in creating better futures, which are not only possible, but are already in the making. Antonia Malchik lives in northwest Montana in the United States and is a non-fiction writer who authored the book A Walking Life, which is a thought-provoking deep dive into the question of who gets to walk and where, as well as the implications of walking for building stronger communities, the future of democracy, and the pervasive loneliness of individual lives. She is an independent scholar with a lively and interactive Substack newsletter, which I would thoroughly recommend, named On the Commons, in which she regularly writes about ownership, property, and what we lose in the privatisation of the commons. In 2016, Antonia wrote a piece in Aeon magazine titled Who Owns the Earth? It's a great piece of storytelling and begins with the following proposition. Private land ownership is a beautiful dream gone badly wrong. It's time to reinstate the forgotten ideal of the commons. But was the vision for enclosing, privatising and owning land ever beautiful, and for whom? We are speaking to Antonia to explore the roots and branches of this question and her quest to understand quite where and when the phenomenon of land enclosure began.
So yes, I'm Antonia Malchik. I grew up in Montana, very close to the Canadian border, about an hour's drive straight north. And it's beautiful. I live in the Rocky Mountains. There's lakes and rivers, a lot of designated wilderness areas. So I spent a lot of time in the woods and hiking and camping and taking my kids out there. So I moved back here almost exactly 10 years ago. I was living in upstate New York. I really was thinking about climate change and thinking about resilient communities, like what makes a resilient community. And I knew that my hometown had a long tradition of community engagement since long before my family had moved here when I was 16. And I just thought, this is a place that I want to come back to. But as far as getting interested in private property in the commons, that's a huge, huge question. And it's what I think about it a lot because that Aeon essay you mentioned in the introduction, it was, what is it? It's like 8 years ago now that it was published. And I sometimes go back to it and think, what was it that got me so hyped up on this subject? Because sometimes I forget. But it was my husband and I had the place where we live in my hometown was an empty lot. It didn't have a house on it. We had to hire a surveyor if we were going to think about building a house here. And just because you have to figure out where the property lines are and you have things about hooking up to city services, and there's so many things that you need a surveyor for. So we hired a surveyor and she came in and just like defined the property lines again, and mark them out with those. I don't know if you have those in Britain, but they do like the orange flags and said, this is where your boundary is. But there was one corner she couldn't find. And she emailed me and described everything she'd done. And she said, well, I can't find this one corner. It's probably under the street. We have to dig up the street to find that and define it exactly. And it's probably a boundary stone that's marked under the street. And I was like, what's a boundary stone? I've never heard of that before. And so what actually happened was she's this brilliant woman. Like she's super smart and surveying is this fascinating profession that I didn't know much about before, but it involves geology and geography and mathematics and being outside and knowing how to use GPS, but also really understanding terrain, including in non-peopled areas. And she put me in touch with the professor at the local community college who teaches the surveying classes. And he's this brilliant guy who told me all these amazing stories about surveying jobs he'd done. And so I actually got really obsessed with this subject. And I was like, well, where did surveying come from? Who thought of that? What a weird thing that we invest so much time and energy in. And so he lent me this book. It's got an enormously long title. It's really old, and it's just about surveying property boundaries in the United States. And it started out with describing markers of field edges along the Nile in ancient Egypt. And the reason they had those was because the Nile would flood and you needed to be able to know where your own, I don't think they had private property in the absolute same way that we think of it now, but just where the fields that you managed and cultivated and started and ended. And so that was like one of the earliest things that surveying was used for. And that is what led me into all this private property stuff. He told me about Andrew Linklater's book, Owning the Earth, which has been really influential for me because Andrew Linklater really goes into enclosures of the commons. Like his book starts out with describing so much of what happened in England over the centuries and just how brutal it was and violent and how hard people fought against it. And then the evolution of private property and land ownership definitions, and then how it spread to other places like Ireland. And what I loved about it was he goes all over the world describing different commons systems of ownership, management, stewardship, whatever word we use for that. And it really opened my eyes to understanding that private ownership of land was never a standard thing. It was never seen as possible or desirable until really recently. And it doesn't serve most people. And his book isn't, it's not a polemic. I was rereading part of it last year for a guided reading group was running. And I was like, he's a little bit, for me, too much on the side of, but private property has done so much good for the world in these certain ways. And I look around where I am in Montana and a lot of billionaires buying up like hundreds of thousands of acres. And I'm like, I'm really not so sure about that actually. But that book really led me into seeing land in a way that I certainly hadn't been brought up to see it. My family, my great grandparents homesteaded in Montana, and that's got its own huge history of theft and claim and privatization of land that had never been privatized before. And so it was one of those things that completely shifted my perspective on what land is, what resources are, what ownership is, what private property is, and why people think it's a good thing, but what it actually does to us, and what it takes from us. So that's how I got into that subject.
I always wonder where people's first point of reflection is. Is it one of those journeys that you end up sort of finding your way into? I mean, a lot of what we talk about at the Centre for Future Natures is about relationships and cultural shifts in order for the practical application of commons thinking on the ground. Can you take us through the social relationships and culture of commoning that you've encountered in your work with walking, and sort of reclaiming the urban? What kinds of communities maybe and networks you've met or helped nurture in your work with walkable cities, and how receptive you think people are to commons-based thinking?
That's an excellent question. I'm still in touch with so many groups of people who do this work around walking. And it is interesting to me that if you're not in this world, you don't really, like, I get people asking me all the time, like, how do you go from walking to talking about private property? And I'm like, I live in America, much less Montana. I'm like, there's no trespassing signs like everywhere we look. Like it's an obvious step, so to speak. So let me think. There's one group in Denver, Colorado, that was started by a walking advocate and writer who's now become a good friend of mine, Jonathan Stalls. He wrote a book called Walk, Slow Down, Reconnect, something. I'm forgetting the subtitle, but it's, I have it right over there, but at 3 miles per hour. And I originally got in touch with Jonathan because I happened to have come across a talk he gave at a TEDx event about walking across America for 8 months just by himself, in different places. And he talked about walking in the way that really speaks to me, because he's just like, you meet people who you think you have huge differences with, and then they invite you into their home and feed you a meal or give you a ride. And you find all these points of connection with them, and your mind slows down and your body feels better because you're moving all the time. It's just all of these things that I know are true about walking. And so I interviewed him about his walk and then his work. And he came back to Denver, Colorado, which is where he lives, and started a group called Walk to Connect, where he ended up cultivating this network of people who lead walks in and around Denver, and for various things. So when I was researching my book, I went down there and I walked with a couple of the different groups affiliated with Walk to Connect. One of them, they meet weekly and they walk through certain parks in Denver. Denver's full of parks. It's a really beautiful city. And another group that just does farmers markets. So they do walking associated with a particular farmers market each time. And then another group was led by this woman named Pam Giner, and she's just like full of energy and does so many things in her community. And she leads a chapter of Girl Trek. And Girl Trek was started by two women who, one of them was a teacher. I think she was a middle school teacher. And she said she was reading statistics on African American women's heart health. And other issues, and looked around at her classroom of mostly African American girls and was like, well, what am I teaching them if this is their future, by the time they get in their 20s or 30s even. And so she started Girl Trek, which was originally getting girls out, African American girls out hiking. And then it really expanded. And I bring this group up all the time because I think as far as reclaiming your communities, recommoning your communities, getting reacquainted with public spaces that are meant to be public spaces, and also getting in touch with your own bodies and your own embodied power as a human being, just a living human being on the planet. I can't think of a group that does better work than they do. I walked with a group in is it St. Paul, Minneapolis area also, in a neighborhood that I wrote about in my book, where this was one of those places where when the highways were being built in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it just smashed through this neighborhood. It's like this massive 16-lane highway canyon, and it just stole basically all of these neighborhood businesses, houses, all those connections that people had that they had built within their community. So I walked with them in Rondo and really learned about how that community is rebuilding all that social capital as well as other kinds of, more physical capital. And every time I read about one of these Girl Trek groups, they're also connecting people with their community, and in ways that, a lot of people who read and write about walking just don't talk about. Like, why doesn't this place have a sidewalk? Why, like Pam Giner in Denver, when I walked with her, she'd point out, she's like, here's where we took the city councilors, because this park that we're walking in doesn't have a sidewalk from that neighborhood that leads to here. And also that crossing, which we crossed and almost got hit by someone driving a truck on. She's like, it's really unsafe. And so finding those things that make walking inaccessible or difficult seems to be integrated into at least most of the groups I've talked with and walked with who run under Girl Trek. As far as a model for activism, I just can't think of a better place to start and a better place to keep going. You're frustrated with your community, injustices of various kinds, and you're trying to fix it and you don't know how. You connect with people and you start trying to figure out how to make small changes. I'm always telling people who are frustrated with politics in the US, I'm like, well, there's a lot to be frustrated with, but I'm like, have you looked around where there aren't sidewalks in your community and figured out why? Like, what's stopping those sidewalks from being built? Whose lives are being limited because there's not a sidewalk there, or a crosswalk, or there's some huge highway overpass that makes it impossible to get from this part of town to that part of town. You might live in one and work in the other, and there's no bus. Buses are something I bring up all the time, which is, it's funny because people tend to find buses in the US, at least it seems a very boring subject to a lot of people. There's also railvolution. And they've been around since like 1995, I think. And that's a US based organization. But I went to their conference in Pittsburgh one year. And, it's like urban planners and elected officials who care about public transportation, city planners, all kinds of people, transit advocates. And it's another one of those things that people are like, why is that interesting? And I'm like, because one of the essences of freedom, along with being able to feed yourself, is being able to get around. And if you can't get around, then because there are barriers in your way, then your freedom is being limited by policy choices and infrastructure choices. I've gone back into like John Locke and William Gladstone and trying to figure out where the roots of these ideas about private property are, and like why people think it's beneficial or why we think we would have the right to claim it. And, my mother's ancestors were Montana homesteaders on one side, but my father's from the Soviet Union. And so where I live in Montana is very politically conservative. And so I run into a lot of communism baiting, I guess, around both Russia and China. And I grew up with that because my father emigrated from Russia when he was almost 30. He didn't even speak English at the time. So I grew up during the Cold War with a Russian father in a very rural place. Like, I'm very familiar with this rhetoric. But it's interesting because the idea that you either have capitalism or you have Soviet-style communism is so embedded in people, and trying to find ways to untangle that to see the commons, the ancient commons, which is probably the way we can be most free, is it's a challenge. It's kind of become my life's work locally, along with trying to get a bus system where I live, which we don't have. So.
I think the work of David Harvey, the urban geographer, is very helpful for thinking about possibilities and ways of remaking the urban places that we know today. So, building on his right to the city concept, I'm going to read a quote from him from a piece he wrote in 2008. So the quote goes like this: "The question of what kind of city we want cannot be divorced from that of what kind of social ties, relationships to nature, lifestyles, technologies, and aesthetic values we desire. The right to nature is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. It is, moreover, a common rather than an individual right, since this transformation inevitably depends upon the exercise of a collective power to reshape the processes of urbanisation." End quote. So I just wondered how you feel this can help us look at urban places in different ways, in the sense that we should have the right to transform urban spaces which we inhabit and make our daily lives. So can you maybe share stories of collective power you've witnessed in your activism pushing for walkable towns?
I think maybe I would answer that at least from a different starting point, because what I'm thinking about is private property. So what is it that makes it so hard to change cities? I mean, anywhere really, but I understand why he's talking about urban areas and cities in particular. And it's not just property, it's real estate. It's who and how took this land that used to just be land, decided it was theirs, built something on it, and then profited from it, and who is continuing to profit from either the existence of that thing or its increase in value, its increase in rent. And it's interesting. I'm always going on about this to people because it frustrates me, but people are always talking about Adam Smith and the free market and, Wealth of Nations. And I was like, have you read Adam Smith? Because I have. And, he warned very strongly against rentierism, and monopolists. And to me, he probably wouldn't have seen it this way, but to me, that connects with the damage that absolutist private property perspectives kind of outsource to the commons, to other people, to the rest of nature. Because in a capitalist system, you can't question someone's right to profit from their property, no matter what the damage is to the rest of life around them, including social life, including access to nature. And one of the most influential books I've read over the past several years was Henry George's Progress and Poverty. Henry George was, I guess he was an independent scholar. He was an economist, but not like formal university trained who lived in America in the 1800s. And he published this book in 1879. It's huge. It's for people who are interested in this kind of thing. It's really worth reading, but he was inspired. I don't mean inspired like I'm creatively inspired. I mean, he was inspired to start asking as he traveled around the American continent during the 1800s, when it's still very much in this colonialist expansion phase. And he would go to like California and look at and say, why is it that there's so much progress and so much growth in wealth, and at the same time, so much increase in poverty? Wherever he went, that's what he found. And what he landed on was that it was land ownership. And there's this great, I can't remember if this is in his book or it's in the book that I read that referred to him that led me down that path. But it's this wonderful anecdote. It's just, an imagining thing like Einstein used to do, just like imagine if. And you've got unpeopled land, and it's got water and trees and game animals and plants that you can eat. And the first person arrives there, and they build themselves a little house, and they use the river and just live a happy life. Well, other people start coming because they want to live there too. And this person says, well, I was here first, or say it's the first 10, 20 families. We were here first. Well, we've now decided this is our property, however wide they want that to be. And also we own the rights to the river. So if you want to use the water, you have to pay us. And this description, it goes on in a way that kind of describes the absurdity of that. Like, just because you were the first person there and can enforce what you think is your claim, that you can start charging people for what nature gives freely. It's just, it lays it out in a way that makes a lot of sense. But then he also goes into what happens when a city is built, a city in particular, or a town. And you assuming that this is the system, you accept that land can be owned. You buy a plot of land, and you build something on it. Well, if it's there by itself, there's no profit in it. Like if you have a coffee shop in the middle of nowhere, you're probably not going to make much money, or an apartment building. Stuff starts going up around it. And if that's high value stuff, like more apartment buildings, more coffee shops, places for people to work, places for people to walk, then the value of your property goes up, even though you haven't done anything more to it. And so his whole thing was that the increase in value of land that's underneath whatever you've built on it is due to what the community puts into it, not what you put into it. Universally, just like whatever you've done to increase the value of that land is generally on top of it. Farming's a little different. He didn't talk much about that, but so his whole thing was to create this land value tax, which says whatever, like for example, the town I live in, it's a tourist town, and over the past few years, it has attracted a lot of remote work, a lot of wealth. We've got a horrible affordable housing crisis. And like the value of my home and the land it sits on has increased beyond, like I could not afford to move here now. There's just no possible way. I haven't done anything to increase that value. It's what's gone on around it. And so his whole thing was, if your property increases in value, like in sale value, that is due to what the community has done to help increase amenities and access. And other things around. So what he wanted to do was to separate the value of the land from the value of the building and tax them separately. And the tax on the value of the land would go to the community who actually creates the value. So It's kind of a long-winded answer there, but it was actually a system that was enacted in certain parts of Pennsylvania for almost a century, and it is credited with keeping housing affordable in those areas because you're not allowing one single landowner to hoard that wealth and keep it amassing it to themselves. It has to be fed back into the community constantly. And going back to the quote you're giving, I'm wondering if that's a way that people can start feeling more ownership of their urban areas. Like if it's not just, some, I don't know, investment company owning big buildings in, parts of London and profiting from them, but never bringing those profits back into the community. If those, if some of that benefit goes into the community itself, does that open the doors for the community to have more control over decisions on how that property is used? And it also makes me think of The Guardian did a report several years ago on pseudo public-private spaces in London. I don't know if you ever read this. It's something I brought up online quite a bit because when people complain about places like Substack or Twitter, like this is our information commons, and I'm like, no, this is more like those places in London that look like public plazas, but are actually privately owned and run by different rules. You think you have access to them, but once you're there, you're no longer a citizen. You are a subject or a customer. Like it's different. And I think that's really interesting. It's also philosophically like how much property is a person or a corporation or an entity allowed to claim? Like the sidewalks are usually public, but in Las Vegas, those sidewalks are often leased to the hotel or casino that's adjacent to them. So it becomes a pseudo private space. And I mean, that quote from Harvey, like it's a huge question of democracy. Like how engaged are people in their local communities and how much are they shut out of that whole process? A lot of urban areas of the US, like those, the democratic process gets captured, and you get certain interests. Like you see this happening in Atlanta, in Cop City right now. Like the majority of people do not want this enormous forest park being taken over to build a training ground for the police department. But the city council has been shutting them out of the process, and so it's like reclaiming the democratic commons as well. Like who gets to be involved in that process, whose voices get heard, and who, which places are subject to enclosure as far as that goes. I think Henry George's model is an actually really interesting one to look at because it was hugely popular when his book came out and into the early 1900s. And, the monopolists and rentiers who benefit from this system, they went all out to absolutely squash any idea of this land value tax going through. And so it's very little known nowadays. There are some economists who specialize, Georgists, they're called, but I think it's a really interesting one because it also looks at land differently. It says you don't own this; it belongs to everybody.
Yeah, I mean the topic of democracy as well. I find that really interesting in a lot of your work. You go back to this. It's hard to raise the topic of walkable cities, for example, but also thinking about low traffic neighbourhoods and going back to Harvey's Right to the City without bringing up the far right. So the sort of conspiratorial theories around these issues obviously has it unfurled across much of the world, including the US where you're based and also in Europe where I'm based, obviously characterised in different ways. And as an example, in the UK, the Conservative government recently lent into the conspiratorial discourse around the urban planning concept of the 15-minute city, saying there was a relentless attack on motorists who depend on their cars to get to work, take their kids to school, do their shopping, see the doctor, which obviously completely misses the point of the 15-minute city. But I wondered if you could explain, firstly, a little bit about the 15-minute city concept, and then the counter-arguments to it, which obviously featured in a lot of conspiratorial circles, and then how you personally make sense of these reactions and mobilisations in response to something that you've dedicated so much of your time to. Because just as an aside, like I heard you speak really eloquently on this topic in the podcast, is it War on Cars? So yeah, I hope that we can make some space to kind of draw this into the discussion now, because I think it's really important, kind of going back to what you were just saying about democracy, and if we want to have the right to kind of define what our cities are and have shared benefits and shared value of these spaces, this is part of the discourse.
So the idea of 15-minute cities, it's like, it was kind of new to me. Like, I didn't know about it as it was being talked about quietly, but and suddenly as it became part of the discourse. But that's actually one of the big things that got me into writing about walking in the first place. There were several starting points, but one of them was that I was living in this area of upstate New York. I had two young children, like a 3-year-old and an infant, or maybe I was pregnant at the time. And I had some experiences that really made me realize how isolated I was without a car. Like, there was just literally nowhere I could go without having to drive there, which meant when I had kids, I had to like buckle them into the seats, and like even to go for a walk somewhere, couldn't do it. And I'd go to this town like 10 miles away, but it was country roads. It was like a 23-minute drive. And just, it's such an exhausting way to live. I was like, I hate this. So I started to make a list in my head of, if ideally, what would I be able to walk to if I could? And I think my list was a library, schools, milk, mail, and a coffee shop would be nice. And groceries. Well, milk, I guess it was like minimal groceries. Like, I was just trying to think of the minimal list. And so I think my idea was within 15 minutes. I think it was within 15 minutes. It might've been 20. But that, I think it's a very natural thing. And the reason they latch onto the 15 minutes is that throughout history, there's a certain number of minutes of commute that people will tolerate without really starting to degrade their quality of life. And, nowadays it can be like an hour or more. But 15 minutes is kind of the ideal. If you can walk 15 minutes to whatever you need to do, it makes your life so interconnected without being smothering. Like, it makes it pleasant to be able to run daily errands. For some reason, a bunch of people decided that the idea that you'd make a city safe and accessible for anyone to be able to get where they needed or wanted to go within a 15-minute, walk, roll in a wheelchair, or a bike ride, was somehow an attack on not just freedom, but identity. People don't talk about it that way, but I've written about this previously, not recently, but about the importance of thinking about identity in these issues. The one I refer to most recently is there was a study out of shutdown of a steel plant, I think it was. Might have been a coal mine, but I think it was a steel plant somewhere in the Midwest of the US. And just this understanding that it's not just about the loss of income or the erosion of community. To people, it's fundamentally about a loss of identity, about who you are. And it is so easy for right-wing talking points to be shaped around the idea of an attack on identity, how they see themselves, how they see their place in the world, and what they see as their rights and entitlements, and what they define as freedom. And unfortunately, somehow, over this last century, cars were defined as freedom in North America in particular, but I've definitely seen it like in the UK and throughout Europe too, just to be able to get in a car and go somewhere. And it's like you're in your own control. You're going under your own power. Nobody can tell you that the train's going to be late, even though people are stuck in traffic for hours and there's always roadworks, and it's like, this is not what freedom is. Like, there are very few places where you can just get in the car and drive, like in an advertisement. But I think just like, it's infected the way that cars are built. I mean, the ones in the US now are so huge. It's absolutely mind-boggling. I've been scared this last couple of years letting my kids and nieces walk to school because they have to cross a couple of roads and the cars are so big. And people kind of do drive in an entitled way. Like, I don't have to pay attention to what anyone else is doing on the road. And it's like, I don't know that I can explain it better than that, except that you're talking about a deeply rooted sense of who you are and how you think the world should be. And someone coming along and saying this, whatever it is, development, whether it's moving away from commodified food to creating walkable cities that, cars aren't allowed to drive through anywhere they wish, is an attack on that identity. And it feels to people like it's an attack on the natural order of the world, the way the world best serves people. It goes really, really, really deep. And there's a lot of issues like that. Environmental issues tend to really top that list. I think the infrastructure that we have, built, how we've shaped our cities. I think if people really think, like, go back to the pandemic, I don't know how much access people had to the outdoors in different places. I know places like Italy and Spain were much more shut in. And I had friends like in New York City who had, it was much more difficult for them when they got outside to like stay distanced during lockdowns. But like where I live, I'd walk downtown and I was like, if people can get out and see this, like see how much space cars take up when they're not there and you can just walk on them, like it's huge. And I think that is actually a good starting place for getting people to see that. So like open streets events, where you close off a street for a day or an afternoon and people can just walk it. I've seen it. Like we've done a couple where I live and I've seen it, especially parents of little kids. Just they've come up to us and said, like, it's so nice that I don't have to be so terrified that my kid is going to run behind a car or in front of a car or something like that. So that's a starting point, just seeing the space that's taken up.
It's we need to start unlearning these things as being normalities and to start learning how to question them. And who's already questioning me, like, as you were saying, there's already a lot of people doing this work. But yes, I wondered if we could move a bit more into the book that you're writing now. Maybe you could share with our listeners about how you're going about publishing it, as I know it's been an interesting process for you.
I remember the title. It's called No Trespassing. What is the subtitle? How the ancient struggle for ownership, private property, and the rights of the commons will define our future. That's what I've got for now. So my publisher for my first book was swallowed up into one of the big 5 publishers, like close to the end of the process. So they're not around anymore. And they actually marketed the Walking book as a health book, which is always interesting to me because I'm like, it's much more of a science book, actually, like popular science, plus a lot of other stuff, maybe sociology, not sure exactly. Anyone who's listened long enough to me rambling here knows that I'm just like interested in everything. Maybe that's why I never did a PhD. I'm just like curious about so many different things and the way they connect to each other. So my agent and I worked on the proposal for this book. So nonfiction books are generally sold on proposal. So you have to come up with like an overview, chapter outline. So like, I don't know, half a page to a page for each chapter, just describing what's in it. So I always find it super research intensive even before I get to write the book. So we worked on it for quite a long time. I'm also super slow just at everything. And we, got it ready. You have to have a sample chapter. It's like 60 pages long. I mean, they're huge things. And she's a great agent. She's super smart. She really understands the industry. And unfortunately, as the responses came in from different editors, it was just no all over the place. And there's a few reasons. One was my lack of social media. I don't have any social media besides Substack. And even that, like they've integrated more social media aspects. And I'm starting to be like, I don't know if I can maintain this any longer. Like social media is a very unhealthy place for me to be. I don't like the person that I am when I have it. So I quit like 2020. I think I deleted my Instagram account was the last one. And so there was a lack of social media and platform in general, which big publishers really want. They basically want you to sell the book for them, which always makes me be like, isn't that actually why I go to you to do this? Because I'm doing the writing. If I were good at marketing, I would be doing that because it pays a lot better than writing and copy editing do. But one of the things that really bugged me, I still think in a way, it's partly that I just maybe didn't make it quite clear enough in the proposal. But people kept saying, they love the writing, they love the concept, they're thinking about it. Like a lot of editors said, like, this really made me think about things differently. But I can't figure out how to package it. I can't figure out how to market it. And what I walked away thinking about, and this is across the board, so nobody picked up this book, it was that the idea of ownership has become so core to the way that most humans see ourselves. This isn't universally true, obviously, but that it's like being inside. I don't know, maybe it's like Plato's cave, the thing where you're sitting in the cave and you're watching the shadows on the wall, but that's not actually the real world, and you don't know it until you get out of the cave. And I maybe didn't figure out how to turn people around to like look at the thing that shapes and defines pretty much all of our lives. But in the end, no one took it. And then I had Substack at the time, and I was going to use it to kind of write stuff related to the book. And a friend of mine who is on Substack, he's English, actually lives in Scotland. And he talked me into publishing it on Substack, like as I write it. He's like, why don't you just turn on a paid version of Substack and see if you can make enough to pay yourself to write this book, that's part of why it's taken me so long. I'm not quite there yet. So that's what I decided to do. And it's kind of evolved over the last year or so as I've started working on that. But I'm hoping by the end of April, I can put out the first chapter. I put out the introduction already. So it's, 9 chapters, I think. It's on, so ownership of land, seeds, water is one chapter, hoarding. I really like this idea of writing about billionaires as a symptom of hoarding, because I see anxiety there. Like, if I don't top my bank account up more than that other guy, then somehow I'll lose, or somehow my safety will be threatened or something. So I haven't dived too deeply into that, but that psychology of needing possessions or wealth, which I think is just a form of the same thing, to make you feel safe in the world. And then people, of course, mostly focused on women, but also slavery, of course. And I wanted to take a different part of that subject and talk about serfdom in Russia, because most of Russians people were unfree until the late 1800s. Also, I think more than 85% of the population lived as serfs. So they weren't allowed to leave their owners' land. They could be punished if they didn't bring enough fruits of the labor. And I think they could choose whom to marry, but they could be sold away from their families. And I think the only thing that wasn't allowed was to just kill them outright. But otherwise, they were property. And this is true in Britain as well. There's, I never know how to pronounce this word. Is it villain? Villein? Really different from serfs, because Britain had serfdom too, right? But it was like you were slightly more free, but you still couldn't leave your landlord's land, like to go work somewhere else. And my ancestors who came to Montana were from Danish ruled Prussia. Prussia only got rid of serfdom in the early 1800s, and so there's this whole history that I feel like a lot of people don't know of ownership of people. That was just kind of the norm all over the world for a long time. And then there's a chapter on data. I think that's a huge one that not enough people take seriously. And then story, the human story, how we see ourselves. Then, what we're talking about with identity and things like, and there's these battles in the US over actually teaching real history rather than the whitewashed in all the different ways version of American history. And it's that it feels like an attack on identity. It's like, who gets to define what the story of the country is, what the story of peoples are? I always think that's a really interesting question, because it has a lot to do with how we see ourselves and how we see our society and how we see our place in our society and everyone else's place in that society. I have a chapter on space. I love space. I love science fiction. I read a lot of science fiction. I
Do
think
you
it does a great job of just having a wide variety of views about how we see our present and what that means about how we see a future.
You kindly sent me a manuscript of your introduction in the post, which I was very grateful for. And something that really captured me, sort of towards the end of it, is talking about deep time, sort of, and thinking about geology and how that's also related to your exploration of the commons, which I am extremely excited to read more about. And also, yeah, all those other chapters. Thank you for outlining the chapters. Actually, I didn't know any of that, how it was going to evolve throughout the book, so that's really interesting, and to learn more about hoarding in relationship to the commons. And I guess it's also to do with accumulation, right, and sort of accumulation by dispossession, and thinking about that in relation to sort of the green transition, and how we can sort of apply that concept.
Well, along the lines of food, like I think what originally got me thinking about that was there's a lot of like super billionaire wealthy people who buy land in Montana, and they'll buy like 300,000 acres, 100,000 acres. And then it's enclosed, you can't go walk on it. This is in Scotland. Like we have no right to roam of any kind. But then, so it's not only that you're shut off from the land and being able to just walk on it, including they shut off like access to public land that's landlocked within private property. That's a really big issue in the Western US. But wildlife has become a really, really big topic around that because elk in particular, for example, will, some of these tracts are so huge that elk can spend their entire migration seasons just on that land, which means if you hunt for food, which I do, and I grew up, like we never had enough money for beef. Like that, just my parents hunted, that's the meat that we had. Mostly deer. Elk is harder to get. But if you hunt, like, and you're relying on access to wildlife in order to feed your family. And, I just really think about enclosures of the commons in early England when I see this happening, because I'm like, it's the same freaking thing. It's happening right in front of us, and so many people can't see it. Because you can't access the wildlife. It's no longer, you can't, it's pseudo privatized, not in reality, because technically they're public. It's a public resource. They're a public resource. But you can't get to it, or you can't go pick berries. And it's actually a really big deal, especially if you're living like I grew up on the margins, really on the margins of being able to feed your family and exist. Having access to wild food is essential. And you can't do that if someone says, well, this land is mine and all the animals are hanging out here, and they can put up a fence. They can fence in the entire, I've seen someone do that just outside of town where I live, some billionaire, he has like 200 acres. And I watched them build this. The fence is not wildlife friendly. Like that's a migration route, and they can just do it. And whatever's in there is in there, and whatever's was trying to get through there can no longer.
I think this is really interesting to mention in relation to how you take great care and sensitivity in your writings about how your ancestors experienced land and sort of their ties to it, and their mobility and sense of ownership is connected to their sense of home, given the migratory histories of your family. And I suppose sometimes this in your writing might appear juxtaposed to how you feel personally today in the future of land ownership. And there was a Substack article that you wrote called Borders Unruly, in which you mention the work of Harsha Walia and her book Border and Rule. And you mentioned a quote from this book, Border and Rule, which goes like this: "A no-border politics is expansive. It includes the freedom to stay and the freedom to move, meaning that no one should be forcibly displaced from their homes and lands, and that people should have the freedom to move with safety and dignity. Those two freedoms may seem contradictory, but actually they are necessary corollaries. The crux of a no-border politics is nestled in the border politics of home. How do we create a world where we all have a home?" End quote. So I guess acknowledging the need in this current political moment, ongoing, for sort of anti-fascist and progressive alternatives to the hard-set conservatism which safeguards private property. How do you make sense of the concept of freedom and home within this current political moment, and how do you feel that perhaps the state prevents a serious conversation about reclaiming the commons in the US context?
The second part of that is maybe easier to answer. David Bollier, who is a commons scholar, and we had a conversation last fall. And before it, he sent me a paper that he had presented at a conference. And he basically landed on, I can't remember the word he used, but it's like a parallel politics, because I think he sees, I hope I'm not misrepresenting his words here, and I don't want to overstate it, but the present structure of the political system and the state is just too hostile to the idea of the commons. Even in the US, where you get some really great stories about like Soul Fire Farm, but someone still has to own it, and like rights of nature, it's still this idea that it owns, the river owns herself, the mountain owns himself. It's still got that language embedded in it. And whether or not that right of ownership is respected really still depends on the state. People think that private property is absolute, but it's like actually profit is a little bit above that, which is why you get oil pipelines through, people's farms when they do not want them there. They can't stop it. So he talks about this parallel polis, like building systems within the system that, like we were talking about, the paradigm shift and connecting all these different people who are doing different things, structures that are in place for if and when those other structures start to get shaky. I heard a great talk about, I think I wrote about this on my newsletter at some point, just about social media and kind of a digital commons idea. And I don't think I quoted this line, but the guy who was presenting it, he said, I think you'll find that people start to get on board with the idea of land back, which is, but it's this idea that we know that all of the Americas is stolen, and how do we settler structures, colonial systems start giving that land back to the people from whom it was stolen? So that's a very raw, messy explanation of what land back is. So he was like, he thinks, he's like, I think Americans would be much more on board with land back than they would with the abolishment of capitalism, because at least with land back, somebody still owns it, so to speak, which is, true. That's the structure that it has to go into in order for it to function within this system. So things like Soul Fire Farm is really inspiring. And I don't know how David Bollier's idea kind of works, but that's part of why I follow his work in his podcast, because he talks to people who talk about this and how it might work, like lawyers who work on rights of nature and how you even think about that, and land back issues. But he said to me a great line that I'm kind of hanging on to, which is, he is most inspired by people who are working out of relationality. So just this huge idea, step back sometimes or frequently from the nitty gritty of whatever it is we're trying to do, whether someone's working on walkability or waste management systems or agriculture, or food commons, and trying to see how you're working out with relationality with, land, people, rivers, life. He didn't go into all of that, but I just thought it was for me, it's a really good thing to hang on to.
I really enjoyed actually something that you wrote on your Substack again, in an article titled "The Land We Won't Share," about violence being an inherent feature of turning a landscape into real estate, I think is what you said. And that's a really interesting angle to think about how private property is maintained. I find that really poignant.
I think I might have run into that in Nick Estes's book, Our History is the Future, because he's got a line in there a couple of times about the project of indigenous repression and genocide was really to take all of this land and turn it into private property. And it does a really good job of helping you see how that happened. And that way, he's a really good writer,
Yeah,
podcaster.
absolutely. Yeah. And I also wondered, actually, sort of segueing from that, this discussion makes me think about the sort of domains of the far right and their defence of property. The case of the Bundy family is an example of the frontier of the far right and anti-environmentalism, but also that you've written on this in the past about how in 2016 the Bundy brothers occupied the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in an armed standoff with the police. And yeah, it was kind of a long drawn out display of sort of ultra conservative defence of private property and protest to government so called overreach. And this was also partly to do with the grazing of cattle illegally on federal land, and how this is sort of all wrapped up with ideas around conservation as well, I suppose, because it raises interesting questions around the model of private property as the bedrock of nature conservation, because the land that the livestock was being grazed on, I believe, was off limits since the 90s to protect an endangered desert tortoise and other rare species. So I wondered, firstly, if you can speak a bit to something that you mentioned in your article at the time, which was about the lack of what you call multidimensionality around the reporting of the Bundy case in terms of how the so-called hinterlands in the western states are presented in this reporting. You wrote that we're either hicks, rednecks and a joke, or we're completely defined by the presence of racists, which I thought was quite a powerful statement. Talk more broadly about the far right's interpretation of belonging and land in the US, because I feel like this relates to what you were saying before about identity.
Yeah, you did prepare me for that question. I've been thinking about it a lot since then, partly because it's really complex because there's a lot of different facets of it. So there's a new book out by Betsy Gaines Quayman called True West that addresses a lot of related issues really well. But her first book, called American Zion, is specifically about that Bundy situation. So she went and spent time with the Bundy family. She's another Montana writer. I so respect the work she does, because I am not hanging out with those people on purpose. Like, a lot of them are around me, but I'm not like seeking out those groups and trying to understand them. But she actually went and spent time with the Bundy family, and has done more than once, I think, for the purposes of her first book. And one thing about that situation with their ranch and their family, because so there's two separate things. The Muller National Wildlife Refuge was one standoff, but then there was another one at the Bundy Ranch years before. And like you said, that situation has been going on since the early 90s. So in the West, you can't really sustain a cattle herd on most ranches. What they have are leases to graze on public land. And his lease was, I think they closed it off for lease grazing. Just cattle are really destructive, maybe not as destructive as sheep sometimes, but they're very destructive, especially like riparian areas. So they'll close off, so the places can heal, or just like you said, there's an endangered species here, we're no longer going to allow grazing. But the thing about the Bundy families is that they're Mormon, and they're very, very, very strict religiously Mormon. And I don't want to act like I know more about this than I do, because Betsy's really the scholar who's dug into this heavily. Within that religion, if you are of a certain persuasion within it, you really believe that God, the Christian God, led the early Mormons to this land and gave it to them. And anything that the federal government or anyone else does or says to restrict your use of it in the way that you see fit is basically against your beliefs. And so that's an aspect of it that makes it a little bit different from other far right situations. There's a deep religious faith in there that doesn't gel well or work well with science. For example, like, the cows are destroying this habitat, we need to stop grazing them on there. But also it runs very much in line with the federal government should not be able to tell us what to do, and they should not own, quote unquote, own land, even though it's not the federal government owning land, it's held in trust for the American people. but that's longer words and people don't like to hear it. So that was that situation. And then the Mahler National Wildlife Refuge, yeah, I think that was triggered by the arrest and imprisonment of father and son rancher who had started a fire that went over into federal land. And then one of the Bundy brothers helped lead a group that took over a national wildlife refuge that was nearby. And one thing I get really stuck on with that is it happened at the same time, or like it crossed over with part of the Standing Rock water protector thing. And I think I talked about this in the piece that the Standing Rock group was unarmed and it was peaceful and protecting water. The Mahler group was armed and violent and very much trying to take public land and re-privatize it. Or I guess it had never been privatized. I'm not totally sure what the history. I mean, it's all stolen to begin with. So let's start there. But the Standing Rock protests, water protectors were subject to police action, privatized military, basically. Like it was really, really, really violent. Whereas the armed group was not touched pretty much until almost the end when one person died. And so I wrote a bit about that actually in that Aeon essay, Who Owns the Earth, that you mentioned at the beginning, because there's this, I didn't know I'd be talking about identity so much, but it still gets into that. It's not just about what they think federal government should or should not be able to do, which is still, that subject is just a never ending spark ready to blow in the Western US all the time. And it often gets into a conflagration over environmental issues. So it's not just about that. It's about entitlement. And by entitlement, I mean, I'm thinking about, there's this really wonderful novel by Joe Wilkins called Fall Back Down When I Die. It's really good. I recommend it to everybody who likes novels. He's from Montana as well, and it's I won't go into the plot too much, but it gets into a lot of these issues. And towards the end, he has this line where the main character, who he's not an activist, he doesn't want to be involved in any of this stuff, but his father had been like an inspiration for far right people, and he wants nothing to do with it, but people keep coming to him because of his dad, and he gets dragged into stuff. And he's trying to understand why his neighbors, who he's known all his life, who fall down these conspiracy holes and things, are so adamant about their beliefs. And he finally decides that it's about entitlement. This land was stolen and it was given to their, grandparents, great grandparents, whatever. And because of that, they believe, like, fundamentally at some deep level, that they have a right to it, to keep it, and to do whatever they want with it. Nobody can tell them what to do with it. And so that's the kind of entitlement I'm talking about. That's kind of a broad word, but I haven't really thought of a better one, because that's an attitude I run into all the time. Like, you can't tell me what to do with my land. And then in that essay, what I actually wrote about was relationship with land. And there's this German philosopher, Andreas Weber, I think, who wrote a book called Enlivenment. And he talks about enclosures of the commons throughout Europe and serfdom and some other things. And he talks about, like, what was taken was not just your ability to sustain yourself, although that was, and forcing you into having to work for someone for wages so that you can eat, but also what was stolen was any access to relationship with the land for the commoners. You no longer get to relate to, the springs or the groves or anything else that people have had a relationship for however many thousands of years. And I think that's something that really gets overlooked in a lot of these conversations, because I think sometimes in situations like that, that need gets warped and it gets funneled into grasping for yourself. And this is mine and you can't tell me what to do with it. But it's still a real need, that need to have a relationship with the land you live on and with, and all of the rest of life it sustains. I mean, I assume I'm talking to the right audience about that, because I think in Future Natures, you like touch on that here and there. And I think it's a really real thing, even if it's just like being able to go for a walk in the woods, if it's not something more spiritual than that, but just being able to have a special log you can sit on. Like my younger kid and I, we have this one spot where we go to pick huckleberries every year. I mean, I pick huckleberries a lot of places, but this is like a special place that we go to together. We spend an hour. They eat huckleberries for an hour. I pick them. And then we go sit by this little tiny creek that's really beautiful and full of moss and things. And that's like a place that we have a relationship with. And I think people crave that. It doesn't have to be something huge. So I think that need is something that feeds into the far right conservative views, relationship with land, the entitlement, all of it. It's interesting, actually, I just turned in an essay for an anthology recently, and I ended up writing about my grandfather, who was a farmer and rancher and a really, really hardcore alcoholic, just drunk pretty much till the day he died. And also just a lonely and often sad person, but a brilliant person. And I was really thinking about like what he didn't love farming. That wasn't what he wanted to do with his life. And I was writing about my own work on trail crews in the wilderness, and just thinking about he probably maybe craved having a relationship with the land that he lived on in a way that didn't require ownership, which had become a burden for him, and he couldn't really let go of because of family obligations and things. But I just, I've been thinking about that more and more. And it's something that's hard to talk about in ways that make a lot of sense to people, except at a very intuitive level. But I think in his book Enlivenment, Andreas Weber described it really well. And I've seen some other people refer to it too. And just, that ability to relate to it. But on a more practical note, with far right stuff and media representations, in that piece, I was referring specifically, it was right after the attempted insurrection in the US, I think, that I wrote that. So there's this journalist, Leah Satilli, who works in the Western US, and she has a podcast about the Bundy family and has done a ton of reporting on all of those situations. She's someone I follow pretty religiously because she works in a lot of far right areas, and just kind of relating some situations she's faced with editors like in New York City and other big urban areas. And, America's an enormous country. Geographically, it's just so huge. And it's really, the media is really dominated very much by a few high population areas, usually on the coasts. And that creates a lot of problems in a lot of ways. But one of them is that you get reporting across the entire country by people who don't really understand most of it, and who find it easy to make stereotypes and easy to say, well, this situation happened because that area is just full of racists or whatever. And it reminds me a lot of when my early career, I started out in travel writing, and I don't know, I just got more and more uncomfortable with it. And I think it's part of that. It's like going into a place and pretending that you can translate it to people wherever you are, and realizing that that's just never true. So I had run into a situation where I was writing a piece about my hometown and, all the walkability work that's gone in here since I was a teenager and before that, and zoning and urban planning, and like why the town feels the way it does, why which is all about policy, wonky, boring to most people stuff, but that's how it happens. That's how you create spaces, is by doing that. And the editor, who was in New York City, came back, this was through my agent, I think, and said, well, you can't talk about that town, Whitefish, without talking about Richard Spencer, who was at that point high profile white supremacist. And, as if that person defines the place I live. And I totally got why he thought that. But it really bugged, because it was like, okay, that shows that it's not just that you don't understand my town, but you also don't understand any town, really, any community, which is full of a very mixed bag of people. And I think the problem is not that those attitudes exist, but that there are very few outlets that tell stories that are varied across the country. There are a few, like High Country News is one I read a lot. That's about the American West. And when that's your only news source, then you miss a lot of stuff. And the reason I wrote that piece was because Leah Sotilli had written about this first, just like the insurrection was not a surprise to her, and the kinds of people who were involved in it were not a surprise to her. And I felt the same way. I was like, I've been seeing this like growing since I paid attention, since I was like 15, 16 years old. I've seen it happening, and it keeps getting ignored because most of the media sources aren't here. They don't understand. They see it as a caricature when it's real and has real consequences. And that was one of the real consequences. That's part of why I wanted to include this idea of like the human story in the book, because that's the last chapter. So I'm not anywhere near really figuring out what I'm going to say in it, but I think it's really important to understand like who defines the stories, how do we shape them, how do we understand our society, who like quote unquote owns the narrative of just about anything. The only thing I can do is keep pointing to people like Betsy Gaines Quayman and Leah Sotilli and other journalists who are doing that kind of work and be like, read them and believe what they're reporting to you, because it's important and it's real. And there's nowhere you're going to live that's going to protect you from it. Just because you don't live in nowhere, Montana, does not mean that it's not coming to your doorstep. And the attempted insurrection should have shown people that.
You were saying before about trying to connect humans with the land and having this opportunity to create relationships with the land, whether that be in an urban space, a community in a town, or whether it be the land in a more rural context. It's being able to have the opportunity to create those relationships outside of the paradigm of owning land or ownership in general, ownership of any sort of resource or fundamental need. It's, the likes of Robin Ball Kimmerer and her book on breading sweetgrass, and in that talking about the honourable harvest and thinking about how it's even possible to carry out an honourable harvest, or thinking about your time with the huckleberries or foraging, whatever it might be, being able to have the opportunity or the access to these things in an honourable way when you don't even have access to that land itself. Here in the UK, for example, with Nick Hayes, I'm sure you've come across his book, The Book of Trespass.
That book is tremendous. When you're talking about the concept of land back in the UK, like that's...
Yeah, and the movement that kind of sprung out of that book in terms of the right to roam movement that we have in the UK now, which is demanding just basically expanded access to rights of way, like the right to roam, and to not be shimmied into a very small percentage, things like 8% of land in England we can publicly access. So that movement is precisely trying to illuminate this schism between humans' connection directly, this very tangible, physical, visceral relationship with land where we can either walk on it or smell it or enjoy it, and but in order to have the opportunity to repair those relationships, we need to have the ability to access that land, and obviously the whole time it's enclosed and privatized, that seems far away.
I think Nick Hayes' book, The Book of Trespass, it did so much scholarship in that way, and it was written so well. It actually made me rethink what I was doing with my book when I read it, because I'm not a very confrontational person. I don't like conflict, but it was one of those things reading it where I was like, I really need to be better about being a little more forceful and less accommodating in what I think justice is around these issues. Because I do try to like meet people where they are and see everything from all sides, and tend to be conflict averse a little bit. But just he was so like beautifully written and firmly stating how unjust it was at every turn. And I think that's actually really important. I recently read the book. It's a new one, The Conservation Revolution. And it articulated a lot of what I've been thinking about and talking about in a couple of talks I've given. the way the conservation groups are in the US at least are always very like private property is bedrock. I know I've quoted that line a lot of times on my on my newsletter, but it comes up a lot. It's like they will not touch the idea of private property rights. Like that's a live wire in conservation. You do not touch it. You will scare away landowners and scare away donors. And I just keep thinking it's like that idea of I'm not a religious person in like the Judeo-Christian religious sense, but I always have that line, is it Bertrand Russell, who's like, faith can't exist only in the places where science can't reach. Like, when certain religions like complain that science is like tried to go too far into matter or creation or something, it's like that's not what faith is. If your faith is threatened by science, then it's not fully faith. It's steering very far out of the subject matter, but I kind of feel like that about conservation as well. Like if we're completely limited by only what private property owners will accept or will take on, then we lose. And I always blame this on being half Russian, but I tend to be pretty fatalist. So like that's where I like cozy up in a little hole and I'm like, everything's rubbish and it's all going to fall apart, but that's okay. We do the work anyway. But my father grew up in Leningrad, and he was born just like at the end of World War II. And my grandmother and the two older kids were evacuated during the siege of Leningrad. And my grandfather survives near starvation during the siege of Leningrad. And then, they come back and they're still ruled by Stalin. They're Jews under Stalin and his purges. And I just, people ask me about hope and children and all these other things all the time. And I always go back to her because I didn't meet her until I was 14 because we weren't allowed into the Soviet Union. And there was nothing for her to hope for in her life as far as like the values that she believed in and her ethics and her morals. She was a very honest person. My grandparents were very committed to being ethical and moral people. But she raised children and lived her life anyway. And she stuck to those values, even in situations that nearly got them imprisoned or killed. And that's often what I hang on to. It's like, we don't always get to bring our children up in the situations that we would really wish for. And yet we try anyway, we try to keep the best of humanity alive anyway. And I think that's what she did. And that's at least the lesson that I take from her.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I feel like that's a perfect way to end this conversation, actually. I think leaving it with her. You've been listening to an episode of the Future Natures podcast. We've been talking to Antonia Malchik, the author of an upcoming book titled No Trespassing: How the Ancient Struggle for Ownership, Private Property and the Rights of the Commons Will Define Our Future. To be more inspired by Antonia's work, follow her Substack under the name On the Commons. All of the many books, people, podcasts and research referred to in this conversation can be found in the show notes, where you can also find out how to subscribe to the Future Natures newsletter. Until next time.